everyone again. I'm Dylan Reed with Advanced Energy Economy. I think just with the way that this kicked off with Charles and Rod, looking at this from the foundation and launch of the Clean Capitalist Coalition, what's AEE's perspective in this, and why are we participating in this conversation and discussion? I think the way we look at it really is where are market forces going and where is energy investment going, and how does policy interact with that? So really at AEE, we represent the vast advanced energy industry, which is now $200 billion, representing over 3.4 million jobs across the United States in all 50 states. And that's an industry that has grown, I think, 3 times the pace of GDP. So this is really a rapidly growing industry across all types of technologies, whether that be energy efficiency, renewables, energy storage, advanced nuclear, and many other, electric vehicles and many others. But as these markets adapt, policies have to update with those as well. And that's really been a focus of AEE's policy drivers at both the federal and the state level. And that you really have to allow for market forces and consumer preferences to thrive. So we've really seen this, I think, throughout all the discussions throughout today, starting the day with Commissioner Chatterjee and his focus on removing market barriers to energy storage. There's another docket at FERC right now that is looking to remove barriers to the aggregation of distributed energy resources. You saw this on the first or the second panel of the day, talking about reducing barriers to clean energy investment, whether that be a wind energy deployment, states and how they're able to do that, like Utah, or large consumers like Microsoft and Apple who are doing that. And you saw how Apple is taking a leading role in that. So really, I think when you look at the launch of this coalition, that's really the frame that we're looking at it from. You're seeing market forces and consumer preferences driving this massive industry. But we need to make sure is that policy ultimately does not stand in the way of innovation. I think that's what we're really excited about, that conversation that we had in July, but as well as bringing all these groups together to continue that conversation, because I think what we're looking at is really reducing the barriers to this investment, because there can be a lot of controversial statements when it comes to clean energy, but I think saying that technology moves faster than government is not one of them. So what we're doing is talking about those policies to ensure that we can continue to make sure that policy, it might not keep up with technology, but we can do our best to make sure that's not standing in the way of it.
Right. Thank you, Dylan. So Wayne, you are, Pacific Research Institute is one of the think tanks that was set up by Anthony Fisher, who you may not know of, but he was one of the Johnny Appleseeds of the conservative think tank movement, who set up the Manhattan Institute, the Institute for Economic Affairs in London that advised Margaret Thatcher, Fraser Institute, Pioneer Institute, Atlas, and many. And I think Atlas has gone on to pioneer about 300 or 500 think tanks worldwide, continuing his work. But PRI does work in California, and we're very happy to have you with us, Wayne. Wayne has been advising me on clean tax cuts for several years. He actually was a co-author with Arthur Laffer on a fairly influential paper that Laffer did in 2007 with Wayne on the supply-siders' dream version of a carbon tax. Which I think is the version that's been pretty much endorsed by R Street Institute and some of the more conservative advocates for a carbon tax. Wayne has now gotten interest in clean tax cuts and is going to be authoring some of the first academic papers in peer-reviewed journals on clean tax cuts. So, Wayne, why don't you tell us a little bit about that work that you're doing and what the papers, give us a sneak peek of what you're thinking the paper should say, and what are the next few papers that should follow on after that?
Absolutely. I just want to thank everyone for being here. Again, I'm a senior fellow with the Pacific Research Institute, and what we always look for is kind of what's the free market solutions to a lot of pressing public issues. And I think what was particularly interesting about this issue, what kind of draw us to it is it's such an important issue, right? There's so many contentious kind of factors going on. How do you balance out not just economic growth, but the welfare of some of the lower income people who some of the carbon taxes and other policies are particularly kind of onerous on. And what was, I think, particularly important in this, and what we're trying to bring out in the paper, is the idea of incentives and bonding constraints, if I can use a little economic jargon, and I apologize for that. But generally, when you're looking at kind of how do you find the right policy, what you want to do is, what are the bonding constraints, right? What are the constraints that's preventing us from getting to kind of that more optimal outcome? And when you look at kind of some of these markets, you notice that we've made incredible strides in alternative energy and wind, solar, but we need more, right? We're not where we want to be, especially across all the technologies. And so if we have kind of that problem, right? If we have an inadequate amount of innovation, right? Then as opposed to using negative incentives, right? Which is what current policies are looking at. How do we put a negative incentive on something that's bad? What if we used a positive incentive to encourage people to do what we know the solution is? And one of the advantages of using a positive incentive as opposed to a negative incentive, if I can use the dog example, and I'll be politically correct, right? If you scold a dog, right, you don't know where the dog is going to go, right? But you know where the dog's not going to be. He's not going to be where you scolded him, right? If you use a positive incentive, right, if you give a dog a treat, you're going to know exactly where that dog is. He's going to be where you're giving him that treat. If we apply that, right, the great thing about the clean tax cuts is we're providing kind of that treat. We're saying if we lower the cost of capital, increase the return on equity, investors are going to prefer, all things equal, to be investing and bringing all of this capital, right, which could go to all these different industries. It could go to pharmaceuticals, it could go to technology, right? We want more in this clean technology. If we have these high returns possible, right, you're going to get that kind of empowering of individuals. And it's not about markets, it's about individuals, investors, who are going to look out across the landscape and they're going to see all these potential opportunities, right? So in the paper, what we're trying to do is work out this logic, work out how it works differently than kind of the current kind of negative incentives, right? Instead of focusing the externality, focus on the technology constraints and how do we overcome those constraints, and then kind of just play with some of the permutations, bonds versus equity, right? How does that differ? How does it change the incentives? And keep fleshing out these ideas so we fully understand kind of what changes that we're making and the power that can come from the clean tax cuts.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you, Wayne. You also had some thoughts about the economic drag that is imposed on the market by, I think your first paper is on the carbon tax versus the clean tax cut. What in a nutshell, just a minute, what is the difference? Right. Any tax, right, whatever it is a negative incentive, right? If you put a carbon tax on the economy, what you're going to be doing is you're going to be disincenting any type of activity that produces carbon. Part of that disincentive is going to be manifested in lower output, which is an economic cost. It's going to be manifested in higher prices, which is a burden on lower income individuals. So that is kind of what we call in economics, again, jargon, a deadweight loss in the economy. So if you use a carbon tax, you're creating a loss on the economy by definition. If you're using these tax cuts, and particularly it's very important because you want to be revenue neutral, if you combine that with a reduction in spending, we spend a lot of money to destroy the environment, which is just horrific, right? So if we can combine those two policies together, we're not going to have a revenue impact, right? And depending upon how you obviously structure the tax, the revenue impacts could be smaller. But if you combine with the spending cuts, you have a revenue neutral proposal and you're not imposing a negative impact on the economy, which is one of the concerns of a carbon tax, right? You're diminishing people's welfare. In this case, with the clean tax cut, we can help the environment and not harm the economy, and in fact, through innovation, help prosper and encourage economic growth.
Thank you, Wayne. That's a very concisely said. Rich, tell us a little bit about two things. Why the need for this coalition? And what can it do for the American consensus around energy and conservation and the environment? And two, tell us a little bit about what a Clear Path is doing in this area.
Great. Well, thanks, Brad. Thanks to all of the other founding members here, I guess, of this coalition. We're thrilled to be participating in this. So if you sort of look at the founding principles of this effort, more innovation, less regulation, a greater role for American technology and manufacturing competitiveness sort of around the world to drive this change around the world. These are all sort of core founding tenets of ClearPath. So we're just very well aligned with this effort. At ClearPath, we focus on making clean energy cheaper, not traditional energy more expensive. And we believe if you simply look at the track record of policy here in the United States and around the world, that's simply the policy with a better track record. If you look around the world at all of the places where folks have attempted to make traditional energy more expensive, they either haven't been able to sustain the political will to keep those policies in place, or even worse, as I think ClimateWorks just showed a couple of weeks ago in its sort of buy clean analysis, in some cases that approach, like in Europe, has actually led to a global increase in emissions because it's chased emissions out of Europe and manufacturing out of Europe and to other parts of the world where the economies are dirtier and less carbon productive, and therefore it may actually have increased overall emissions. So the key where you can actually drive real, sustainable reductions in emissions are where you can make clean energy cheaper, right? And that's what we've done here in the United States. Over the past 2 decades, we've had a remarkable series of policies and successes in technology on shale gas, wind power, and solar power. We've had targeted innovation programs, so we've spent some hundreds of millions of dollars at the Department of Energy on each of those technologies, and we've had targeted incentives to help scale up those technologies. And of course, the most successful of all those has been the Shale Gas Revolution. That's, Secretary Menzies and many people mentioned earlier today, the 400 or 500 million bucks that we spent on that at DOE, and about the $10 billion we spent on the alternative production credit has produced a spectacular new technology that is better in performance than what it's replacing, that is cheaper than what it's replacing, and that's a heck of a lot cleaner than what it's replacing. And so that's kind of that's the holy grail, right? Could we do something else like that that brings us all the way to zero emissions? And the key for shale gas is its performance characteristics, right? Unfortunately, we've had to spend a whole lot more than that to get wind even to where it is now, and that's because, frankly, it's not as good a performing technology as natural gas. It's not a flexible, dispatchable technology in the way that natural gas combined cycle power plants are. So the question is, how do we get all the way to zero emissions with a highly flexible, high-performing technology? And of course, we know there's a couple of candidate technologies out there for that, right? There's grid-scale storage, which would turn intermittent renewables into highly flexible technologies. There's fossil fuels with carbon capture attached to them, so things like the net power plant that's going up down in Texas, or the Petronova project that the Department of Energy funded, and many others that are attempting to crack that. And there's advanced nuclear, right, which would be much cheaper on the capital, much smaller to build, faster to build, manufacturable, and much more flexible than the existing technology, and probably many others that we don't even know about, right? And so the question in our mind is, well, what is it, alongside the kinds of policies like clean tax cuts, and we applaud all the work that you've done in thinking about that, which will scale up the existing generation of intermittent technologies, how do we get that breakthrough that'll get us the rest of the way? I mean, study after study has confirmed that we need some kind of flexible technology to go alongside the intermittents if we're going to get all the way to zero emissions at any reasonable cost. And our theory is you're not going to get to zero emissions around the world unless you can do it in a cost-effective way, unless it can actually be economically advantageous for all of the emissions in all of the countries to come. The Nigerias and the Indonesias and the Indias and the Chinas that are going to build massive power fleets into the future for their huge populations. Unless you have something that's actually a better mousetrap, those folks just aren't going to build it. They're going to build what they have, right? More unmitigated coal, more unmitigated gas, ideally some renewables, and we're not going to get to a zero-emission global fleet. So the question then is, how do you do that, right? And how do you do that in a way that sort of, abides by our shared principles here? More innovation, less regulation. Well, the thing I want to talk about today, and I'm very excited that we're going to be followed by Representative Reed to talk about this, because he's circulated some thoughts about some legislation that he and some other members are considering proposing, is taking a concept that I'll say is not dissimilar to clean tax cuts and applying it not to existing already profitable technologies, but applying it to nascent technologies, so things that aren't yet profitable. And so it's a new breed of tax incentives that are meant to be set up rather than as a one-off technology-specific thing which has a limited lifespan and maybe will extend, maybe won't extend, has all the industries coming back to the trough to get their tax credit extended, things I think we can all agree would be better to go away. It's in fact a permanent incentive through which one technology can only go for a fixed amount of market share. So the higher the market share they take in the country, the more the incentive ramps down. And so it structurally ramps down over time to allow those technologies to off-ramp themselves and sort of wean themselves off of the initial incentives. And very importantly, it would be paid out in a radically different way than either the investment tax credits we currently know or the production tax credits we currently know. It would be tied, rather than how much you invest or how much you produce, to how much you make, right? So the more you make in the market, the more incentive you would get. And that's very important because the more dispatchable, the more flexible you are, the more money you make out in the power markets. So it's an incentive that uses market signals to target the incentive. The technologies that are the most flexible and can best respond to market signals are the ones that would get the most incentive. And so it would drive innovation toward the flexible zero-emission technologies we know we need. I'm happy to talk everybody's ears off about this at a later time. I should probably stop here and we can move on, but happy to discuss it further with anybody.
Well, that sounds very interesting. You know, if anybody has any questions, you can jot them down, and I think that we'll pass them forward and we'll field them. We'll move on to Drew at American Council for Capital Formation. American Council for Capital Formation is, like Smith Richardson Foundation, one of those organizations that's been around for quite some time, going back to the 1970s, I think, set up by Richard Rahn and a couple of other supply-siders around him. You can fill us in on the details, but they've been holding salons for many, many years, and last night they held one, but I can't tell you anything about it because that's a rule. But you know, Drew, maybe you can give us a peek under the hood. American Council for Capital Formation is now going to be launching a new, I think you call it your, what is it, the Center for Energy Innovation?
Center for Energy Security and Climate Economics.
Ah, okay,
yeah.
Great, okay, good.
Yeah.
Well, I like that link of energy, security and climate economics. So what do you think are the, in this space of reducing barriers to clean free enterprise and, opening up participation to people and establishing economic rights and freedoms, where does that fit in with, energy economics and security? What policies are you looking at?
So thanks for the question, Rod, and thanks for the opportunity to be here during National Clean Energy Week and for CRES putting this event on. I think this is an exciting culmination of a lot of work that's been going on for years, and I think a real opportunity that free market folks, particularly on the right side of the aisle, Republicans, conservatives, Democrats, have really begun to embrace this issue of climate change and how do we actually address it from a free market perspective, believing that it's absolutely the best way to scale the fastest, the most efficient, to have the largest impact in our lifetime. So American Council for Capital Formation, as Rod said, has been around since 1977. Richard Rahn, Mark Bloomfield were two of the founders, and really started with the Reagan Revolution and the need to address tax reform. And so historically, ACCF is really focused on reducing barriers around taxes and trade and regulations. It's only recently, within the last few years, that we've waded into the waters of energy and the environment for good reason. And so I joined the organization about a year and a half ago. We brought George David Banks back from the White House and the National Economic Council and the National Security Council to join us. And as Rod mentioned, we this week are launching our new Center for Energy Security and Climate Economics. And the whole premise there is that, it's really time for Republicans, free market conservatives to sort of move beyond the answer of no to climate and begin embracing some real solutions. Because again, we believe that the best ideas win. I was very much had that ingrained in my DNA as a young kid in Texas and Oklahoma, and fast forward to working on Capitol Hill and eventually being chief of staff at the Heritage Foundation. there's a book that you can go read called The Power of Ideas. And that book talks about competition, and even that organization, especially that organization, believes in the power of good ideas. So much so that actually the Center for American Progress didn't exist at one time and went to Heritage to ask for advice. And Heritage gave it advice because it believes so deeply in that principle. So, not to get off on a tangent there, but the point is that competition is a beautiful thing, and it really helps create the best ideas. And so, we believe at the American Council for Capital Formation that we can address these climate issues. We believe that you have to take an integrated approach in thinking about taxes and thinking about regulation and thinking about energy security and prioritizing that. And then you have to really take a realistic approach as to what can we get done in this administration as opposed to wait for some future administration. What can we get done that is durable from this administration to the next administration, regardless if it's a Republican or a Democrat? So we haven't yet advocated for any particular policies. We're very interested in looking at good ideas. And so, Senator Reid's one I think is a great one. This technology neutral approach certainly adheres to these free market principles. Looking at the clean asset bond idea is one that we're interested in understanding the impact of that economically. So, I think there's a bunch of good ideas on the table. Let's spend a little bit of time, not too much, really diving into what the real impact is, and then let's get moving.
I just want to take a moment here to mention that there are other members of the Clean Capitalist Coalition in the room that really, and I want to recognize them. I've already mentioned ACEEE, and I see Steve Nadell over there, who is leading the ship over there and has helped pioneer the charrette on real estate, and then went on to design the Clean Free Market Act proposal. With the help of course, another charrette. But we also have in the room Mark Pichet from the Conservative Energy Network, and Mark has joined, and they are fantastically important at mobilizing the grassroots at the state level on conservative energy issues. And Mark has told me that he would like to take this council on the road to the states where this message matters and where there are policy groups that would like to plug into what we're talking about to pioneer new ways to remove barriers to clean free enterprise at the state level, and maybe talk to governors about the Clean Free Market Act and how they can lead nationally and internationally on that. We have Sarah Hunt here from the Rainey Center, and Sarah has joined as a member, and the Rainey Center is already taking the Clean Free Market Act to Brussels, where they've been invited to present some of their ideas, and they want to present that in Europe. And Sarah is also formerly was with ALEC and intends to, I think would like to socialize this idea with state legislators across the country. She has an excellent network of state legislators that work with her. So thank you very much, Mark and Sarah. And also, I definitely want to mention Mr. Trammell Crow. Is he in the room? I saw him here. Did he slip out? Well, okay, well, he'll be back. Well, I'll point him out when he comes in so you all know what he looks like. But Matt Myers is over there. Earth Day, Texas, first got involved with us and came to the very first charrette in New York, and then they changed their name to EarthX. And EarthX has been, a champion of what we're trying to do, because I think that Trammell realizes that in Texas, they've got a ton of Republican voters and Republican state legislators and congressmen and folks in politics. And none of those guys want to go to Earth Day, Texas and hear left-wing ideas. They want to hear conservative ideas, and they want to hear interesting new conservative ideas. They've got oil and gas underground, farming at ground level, and they've got sun and air above. And they want to figure out how to, policy that supports and accelerates all of that, lets them make money, and also gives them a framework that's consistent with conservatism and also keeps the air and water clean in Texas for their families. So, I believe Trammell wants to, Trammell's on a perpetual world tour. He wants to take this idea on a world tour with him and take the Clean Capitalist Coalition around the world with him. So you may all be going on a plane to Hawaii soon or Abu Dhabi or something like that. But, to bring it back to the panel, yeah, do you have a question?
I just want to touch on something you just said, which is, look, I'm from Texas, originally born there, raised there in Oklahoma. Primarily, at least rural, my background anyway. And, clean energy is one of these areas, right, that has really begun to transcend politics. And for me, that's what's most exciting about it. I mean, you talk to farmers in North Texas and the Panhandle, they for years have known how to make money off their land, and they know how to preserve and conserve their land, right? They know how to make money off the minerals below the land. Now they know how to make money from the air and wind and from the solar resources off the land. So, I think there's a huge opportunity where, in the past, what has been seen as sort of this bi-coastal, almost, very liberal, left-leaning, only allowed, movement is one that is changing. And I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind as we construct, and put forward policies in this regard is rural America needs to know that they're going to benefit from this clean energy revolution. We can't simply leave them behind. And so, some of the states have benefited. More and more of these rural, places are benefiting. But I just want to sort of flag that for, our own purposes and say, look, there's a huge opportunity for people that know and have known how to take care of the land for years, long before I existed. And so we need to invite them into this, and I think that's a big part of the importance of this week and this initiative, right, is that this is not just for those urban folks who can afford electric vehicle and a battery charging station. And, that's a component and an important part of it, but it's not the only thing. So, yeah, thank you, Rod.
Yes. Well, it's interesting that you talk about the shift. What I've noticed, I mentioned the polarization that's driven by bad policy, but one of the things that also happened, along with that is that I think we saw a lot of millennials who became frustrated with policy even as they went into the Obama administration and they weren't able to legislatively pass policies that they wanted. And they decided to say, the hell with policy, we're just going to go become entrepreneurs and go become venture capitalists. And so you had these people who, instead of going into politics and policy around this stuff, went into business, and they have become these clean capitalists. So you have a whole generation of, I think, millennials in this investment and business space who are now, I think they view the older generation of policy as their parents' fault, really, and they're eager for new solutions. So have any of you noticed that same phenomenon? Yeah. But
as the resident millennial, am I
I suppose so. Yeah.
No, my mother is great. I think the trend that we've been seeing, really, I think, and Texas is a great example of this, is when you're able to embrace the power of markets, the numerous benefits that come from that. And I think that's why AEE has had a principle, and what we've worked on for numerous years now, is believing that markets really should be technology neutral at the end of the day. If you let all technologies be able to compete based on price and performance, at the end of the day, the grid will win, as well as consumers. And that's where I think you're seeing Texas is really a shining example of that, where you've seen power prices going down, investment signals going in the right direction. They're now leading the country in renewable investments as the environment is getting better. investment signals are going in the right direction. The power of markets in the summer, the hottest summer that Texas has had, I think on record, investment signals worked there. There was a huge concern that the market wouldn't be able to work and the lights were going to go down in Texas. And I think ERCOT has a press release coming out, I think next week, that's going to talk about their performance. But we didn't hear about widespread blackouts going on, and that was as there was more investments in renewable energy, natural gas, demand response, energy storage, and all these new technologies that are coming on the grid. So that's a principle that AEE believes in, but we also see that this is now working in the market, and we believe that can continue to move forward with policies at FERC and at the RTOs as well. And certainly we think that they're good examples, but there's more that can be done because as we look at this, the more new technology comes on, these rules have trouble understanding exactly how a lithium-ion battery might bid into services and how much should it be paid for that, and various other technologies on that. So I think that's really what looking forward to and working with everyone on already the conversations we've had, but continuing to move forward on policies that can do that.
And I think the Texas specific, what's important about that is every region, the renewable sources for every region should differ. And so when you talk about the market, you're really talking about local information and how do you empower people and information in those local markets to design the correct kind of low emission, no emission infrastructure. And Texas is going to look different than Maine, which will look different than Hawaii. And so part of like the clean tax cut and this whole technologically neutral is, and I think this is an important aspect of it, is empowering the people in the region who actually understand their constraints, their opportunities better. That's what you really want to see. So it's not kind of a top-down solution where you don't understand the local environment, but you're empowering each individual region to kind of construct the right combination of zero emission or low emission sources.
Can I just say as well, and I will take exception with Dylan's point, I technically am also a millennial. I believe they refer to me as the gray millennials, but I guess I don't look it, so just take it as you will. The point that Rod raised about sort of getting past some of these old bad stalemate ideas. I mean, a terrible legacy of some of our parents' environmental politics is this totally artificial sort of technology picking impetus that then led to very technology-specific policies around the country, right? Like renewable portfolio standards or bans on new nuclear power or the leave it in the ground movement under all circumstances, even if the fossils are developed in a clean way. And I think what we're seeing with a number of the younger generation coming up in this, whether they're bright young nuclear entrepreneurs graduating from the best colleges in the country and going off and founding startups around this, or folks raising venture capital for new technologies which will utilize the carbon dioxide taken from fossil power plants and put it into healthy goods and services. All these things are showing that these old sort of technology fights that frankly are kind of a legacy from a sort of a hippie versus sort of corporate way of thinking about the energy sector. I think young people that realize just how big a global problem this whole CO2 thing is and how we just don't have time to have any of these old fights getting in our way so that we can focus on the real problem. I think that's been a really positive development of the younger generation and thinking a lot more about how do we get to performance-based, technology-neutral thinking and policy and incentive and innovation programs that encompass all technology so that we make sure that we have every tool in our toolkit to take on this global challenge.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. When I first started going up on Capitol Hill, I used to always have the prop. I'd go, if you look at this, your phone, you don't think of this as a democratic technology, but if you look at a solar panel, you might. And I don't have to use that bad example anymore because the depoliticization of the industry, I think, is just very evident. Now, as this whole conversation is going, though, you have to provide the right ideas out there. You can't just keep coming back with the same thing and extensions of old policy and things that may not ideologically make sense to everyone. And I think that's really what I think at the core we're looking for is new ideas that do have that bipartisan approach to it. And I think there's really been a focus of all of National Clean Energy Week, not only this year, but as well as last year.
And I will say I applaud CRESS more than anyone for assembling a Clean Energy Week that has put every zero-emission clean energy technology under one roof and under one banner. This may well be the only place where you can find an assemblage of people like that, where the farmers and cowhands are all friends here and are all embracing the idea that we should be thinking about all these technologies together.
Yeah, no, I agree. Though, I mean, frankly, in my work with the clean tax cuts, we go even further than that, because I think it's frankly, I have a little bit of a problem with National Clean Energy Week and Climate Week, because I think that the focus has to be bigger than that. If you're just focusing on climate solutions or energy solutions, you're trying to develop bespoke frameworks for a set of problems, rather than understanding that all pollution problems and environmental problems are fundamentally related. So if you're looking across the spectrum, I think that the policy paradigms that you develop will be stronger, because your policies will have the same. If the same policy works for energy that works for plastic, right, or that works for water issues, if the same basic policy paradigms work, then you'll get support from a much bigger community, right? It's not just going to be the energy community that's pushing for it. It'll be a very broad base of support. And the policy will likely be better and more acceptable to conservatives, because I think conservatives look at these bespoke frameworks and they say, okay, it looks like a conservative framework for your policy, but why do we want to just do you? They like that neutrality, and they like the more neutrality, the better. So do you guys have any thought? I mean, we've all been working on energy stuff, but personally, I felt that my work had to go broader than that. I'm wondering if any of you have scratched your heads and had that thought too. Or,
well, I'll just say, I mean, I think the beautiful thing about clean energy, and I love the title of this week for this reason, is that you can love clean energy for environmental reasons. You can love clean energy for energy security reasons. You can love clean energy for national security reasons. National competitive reasons, right? I mean, we're in a major global competition. Call it a trade war, call it whatever you want to call it. We're in a major global competition with some major companies, namely China. And so, if environment is not your first priority, but national security is, or national economic competitiveness is, but environment still fits in that mix of priorities, clean energy actually helps address all of those. So I think it's actually one of those areas that helps bring people together, where we can focus on solutions as opposed to fight about sort of the existence of the problem and what caused it. So that's just my 2 cents on this.
We have a question from the audience. How are negative externalities addressed by supply-side economics? Value of regulation of pollutants is not exactly a question, but I guess I'll take a crack at that, and maybe you can too. But I think, as I said, you can look at negative externalities as a supply problem, because there are suppliers of negative externalities, and then there are also industries that accomplish the same thing that don't, supply those negative externalities. So if you want less supply of negative externalities, you incentivize the alternatives that don't have negative externalities. You cut their capital costs, you cut their capital taxes. Wayne, is there something, is that
That's exactly it. I mean, the traditional way is, I think, the carbon tax, right? Which is, we have a negative externality. And you got to remember, the negative externality, we're not out to produce negative externalities, right? We're out to produce something that has value, right? Energy has value, right? A long walk to New York City, it's much easier to take the train. That has value, but the train requires energy, that creates pollution. So the idea is, as opposed to looking at it as an externality problem, which obviously there is the externality, the whole idea is, what if we look at this as a technology problem? How do we incent the positive to get over the negative, as opposed to how do we punish the negative? So it's focusing on, well, you'd like to use carrots and sticks, and we want to focus on carrots, not sticks. So you're dealing with the externality by incenting the positive that gets around it, so to speak.
I guess that, one of the things that, I want to point out is that the way, carbon tax deals with it is the framework of Pigovian economics, and they have this Pigovian tax. The carbon tax is a Pigovian tax. And, but Pigot also recommended Pigovian subsidies, because he pointed out, and this is what we're pointing out too, that the important thing isn't really the tax, it's the tax differential between the good stuff and the bad stuff. So you don't necessarily have to do a tax on the bad stuff. You can also lower the taxes on the good stuff. So by looking at it that way, it gives you more flexibility in your design.
Well, if we want to really get wonky, and please don't fall asleep, but the whole idea of the Pigovian tax is the idea, how do we get, and economists love putting these things out there, how do we get the optimal amount of pollution? Right? When you're talking about carbon tax, that's what you're really trying to do. What's the optimal amount of pollution? And I think what is nice about the clean tax cuts is we're not asking that question. We're not saying how do we get the optimal amount of carbon dioxide. We're saying how do we incent innovation that has zero emissions? And so it's a very different framework because you're not looking at optimal pollution levels. And that's really what carbon taxes are in theory designed to create, that optimal level. In this case, we're saying how do we get better innovation?
Right. So, one other thing I wanted to ask about is, there are clean tax cut frameworks for specifically for innovation. There's a concept that came up at the green bond charrette, which wasn't the green bond idea at all. It was that the first 5 examples of any new clean energy commercial scale plant are almost impossible to fund by a venture capitalist. They won't even touch them because these things are too risky. So they have too long of what they call a valley of death. So what you could do is you could eliminate all taxes on the first 5 for the 10 or 15 years. And what that would do is change the risk-reward ratio. By changing the risk-reward ratio and increasing the risk just for the first 5, you would make them much easier to fund and shorten the valley of death. And if there are any subsidies that are required up front, they could be smaller. And that tax cut that you give, the clean innovation tax cut, wouldn't cost the taxpayer anything for business failures because it would only apply to the successes, the ones that actually make money. This is a model that really hasn't been developed properly through the charrette process. It's just an idea that was thrown out there. But it needs to have some group take a hold of it and go, yeah, we want to do a charrette on this and figure it out. But I'm wondering if, and what you guys think of this model and what you guys think of this concept, because it needs somebody to take, charge of figuring it out. Go ahead.
Well, we're almost there. I think we're out of time, but very quickly, that's a very, when you get into the intricacies of finance, and that's a very, very esoteric topic, I think what you're saying is exactly correct. You have a area where it's very difficult to finance, and so anything you can do that reduces that uncertainty, you increase the expected return. Increasing the expected return is going to bring in more capital. And that's the overarching theme of clean tax cuts, right? How do we incent more capital into this innovation? And I think if anyone's interested, we could probably talk about this, afterwards, if you come up and talk about that.
Yeah, great. Anyway, thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate your being here and your attention.